So now you've determined all your utilities. You have a good understanding of what it will take to make everything work. Kind of talk about access and easements and mineral rights. So what should a buyer consider regarding access to the property, especially concerning permits and spacing rules?
I think this is one that I see a lot of people get scared about and actually turn away from that vacant piece of land. So you find a piece of property on Zillow, you drive out, you look at it, and it's really rural. There's maybe it's a dirt road, maybe there's you can't see any access to it, maybe there's a little farm access. So don't let that scare you that there's not necessarily a driveway. You talked about spacing requirements. So yes, they don't want the access points to be too close together for safety reasons. And so looking at the spacing between the nearest intersection, if you're out looking at a piece of raw ground and you see the neighbor across the county road has access, they're going to want to line those driveways up. So that's probably where your access is going to be.
Okay.
The counties, some of them have this information online where you can find out if there is an access permit. That will be something you'll need to obtain. Sometimes the plat maps will have that access permit on it. And it's another piece to this puzzle.
Yeah, as you're trying to figure it out. So along those lines, easements, how can buyers ensure they have a clear understanding of easements related to utilities, oil and gas pipelines, ditches, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, this gets really complicated. So again, going back to the title commitment, so you pull that title commitment, that should show you all of the recorded easements on the property. If you mentioned oil and gas, sometimes there are things called SUAs or surface use agreements on properties, and those are related to the use of the surface for maybe an oil and gas pad site. That should be on the title commitment. If you're getting into this level on your piece of land and the title commitment, I'd strongly recommend you have an attorney take a look at it because these can get complicated in a hurry.
Yeah.
But all of that information should be available to you on that title commitment. You mentioned ditches on there. Now, ditches in Colorado have something called a prescriptive right. So you are not going to find an easement for a ditch company on your property. But if you're out, you're looking at that vacant piece of land, you can see that there's a ditch that runs along the boundaries or maybe through it. One, don't assume that you have any right to that water because you probably don't unless it's expressly stated as a water right. And two, that ditch company has a prescriptive easement to enter the property to maintain that ditch. And that's, again, not something that you're going to find in title that's granted by the state.
That's an important thing, especially if you're not going to even see it. So what's the role of surface use agreements? And why is OEC, or owner's extended coverage, insurance important when dealing with land purchases?
Yeah, so surface use agreements, if somebody has, and in Weld County, we see this a lot, maybe somebody has granted a surface use agreement to an oil and gas operator. They have come in and built facilities on that piece of property and they're extracting minerals from it. So the SUA or the surface use agreement is what governs their right to that. You mentioned OEC. OEC is owner's extended coverage. It's an additional layer of title insurance that I would recommend to all buyers, even if a seller doesn't want to pay for it. It's relatively cheap to the coverage that you get. But basically on a title commitment, the title company is not going to cover everything. There are standard exemptions. OEC comes in and adds another layer where they will remove some of the exemptions. Now they're typically going to want to do more research via a survey. And so it's going to cost a little bit more to have that survey done, maybe take a little bit more time to do the research, but well worth it. So I just had a property that gentleman had a farm, subdivided it into 35-acre parcels, worked with the power company to put a utility easement all the way through the property so that each lot had access. He understood that there was an easement recorded by the power company to allow for that. We closed on a lot and learned that easement was never recorded. And that put in jeopardy all the other lots being able to be sold. Now, the buyer did not get owner's extended coverage in that transaction. Had they asked for OEC, there likely would have been that additional layer of research done, and we would have uncovered that before closing.
So you talk about OEC and then the surveys needed to get there. Can you talk through surveys like ILC, land plats, and Alta surveys?
Sure. So those are just kind of different layers of a survey. So an ILC is an improvement location certificate.
Okay.
And that just simply shows you the boundaries of the property and the improvements that are on that property. It's a visual representation of the improvements. The land plat, we see those in any type of land that's been subdivided. The Alta survey is kind of the king of the surveys. And it basically takes all of the information on the title commitment and it puts it in a visual form. So if there's a utility easement, then it will show, this 30-foot utility easement. If there's an access easement, it will show that. It's a visual representation of all that you see on the title commitment.
Yeah, something that makes it a lot easier for people to understand very quickly.
It does. It's expensive and it takes time, but it can be well worth it in the end.
Yeah, very true. So staying on this path, let's talk about other issues people need to be aware of, specifically floodplains. What steps can a buyer take to determine if the land falls within a floodplain, and how does that affect building plans?
Sure. Again, this information, we as realtors should be putting that into the MLS, but as a double check, most of the FEMA data on floodplains is in the county, and so going to the county and looking at that particular piece of property, and is it in a floodplain, is it not, what's the risk assessment on it, and yes, it can affect building greatly. I would say, maybe you've got a piece of property that has some river frontage. You can expect there's going to be part of that property that has floodplain issues, but where you want to build is not necessarily in the floodplain. So again, making sure that you get your builder involved early so that you can understand, yes, this part's in a floodplain, but does not impact me or does impact me where I actually want to build. You're going to want to make sure that you're talking to your insurance company, to your lender, if you learn that the piece of property is in a floodplain. I closed a piece of property a year or so ago in Brush and basically learned the entire community of Brush is in a floodplain. There's ways to overcome it. You're paying more in insurance, but yes, it can impact what you can do with the property.
Okay, I didn't know that about Brush. Learn new things. So soils and topography. Why is it critical to understand the soil composition of the land?
In Colorado, we have a lot of areas that have expansive soils, and that can mean additional expense in the building process. And so if we're talking about a vacant piece of property, it needs to have a soil report done on it. And sometimes, again, you have sellers who are selling their property and it already has a soils report that's been done. You can send that to your builder and they can easily tell you if this is a good or if it's going to require additional dirt work. It's something that I would recommend, again, that buyers get before they buy the property, because it's going to be needed in the process anyway. And if you have an issue, it's money well spent to avoid the problems.
Yeah, and this is one that I can speak to very clearly, because from a soils perspective, it can greatly affect your build in every way, shape, or form. We just had an experience where, two different experiences where we've got property out in Windsor, Colorado. It's a great property, fantastic, but the land requires us because it has so much movement to do caissons. And the caissons on this, and this is a very expansive property, it's a 10,000 square foot property, and we now have to put 107 caissons in this property, which is massively different than a footing and foundation concept. And it's one of those things where, again, the land looked cheap at $350,000, and then you start to look at the cost of putting 107 different caissons in here, and we didn't build it with the footings and foundations aspect, but it's roughly going to be about 2x on the foundations at minimum from that perspective. So soils report is super important from that perspective. And most people have no idea how to read it, and that's fine, but a builder does, and a good builder does, and they can quickly tell you what's going to be necessary on this. And so that can also inform your design and where you go from there to understand that, because that house was very expansive, and had they thought about that a little bit more or understood that from the front end, they could have made it more of a vertical house and the smaller footprint, which would not have then cost nearly as much on 107 different caissons. So different ideas. All right, so dirt, let's talk about dirt and balanced sites. So what does it mean for a site to be balanced in terms of dirt, and how does that affect the overall construction plan?
When we're talking about a balanced site, we're typically talking about a large development. So think about a piece of ground, it's been a farm, it's been irrigated. Think about the ideal topography of that ground. Now think about what a subdivision looks like. You're adding a ton of impervious space with rooftops and streets and driveways. And that water that used to seep into the ground is now running off of these impervious spaces. And so when we're talking about land planning, an engineer will take a site and they'll decide, where does the detention pond go? Where is the water going? So dirt is getting moved around on these sites, and typically you're going to have to bring dirt in. It's very rare that you come out and deposited when looking at dirt. And many people think it's dirt, it's cheap. It's not.
Nope.
It has to be specific type of dirt. And so a balanced site is simply, how much dirt do we need to bring in, or how much excess do we have?
Yep, fair enough. That again does absolutely cost a whole lot of different numbers. So finally, I think if someone is this far in the video, we could talk about the most complicated part, which is practically turning someone into a developer, which is subdividing parcels, right? So if a buyer wants to subdivide their land, say they have a 3-acre parcel and they want to start taking it into 3 1-acre parcels and kind of work along those lines, how does somebody even get started in that process, from that perspective? Because that starts to get super complicated.
It does get super complicated. If you have a 3-acre parcel and you want to divide it into 1-acre pieces, I would be hard pressed to say that would be possible or financially feasible. If it's already that small, it's probably as small as it's going to get. There's a reason why there's not a lot of developers. This is a risky game to play. So I would say, going back through what we talked about, look at what the zoning regulations are, look at the water regulations. But you're not a developer, and there's a lot of risk there.
Yep.
The ones that can be subdivided, there's no guarantee. You're going to need a team of people to do this for you. I had a client that is a developer, a very experienced developer. He purchased a piece of property, and very large piece of property, a lot of water, very expensive, turned around and sold it. And 2 weeks later, the water district in that area issued a moratorium. And so all of this money, and we're talking multi-million dollars, is now holed up until the water district can figure out their issues. So the development game is not for most of us.
Yeah.
I would just say let the developers do their thing and not try it.
Yeah, so it's important to know that even if you've got this 3-acre property, it's much harder to take it down to 1 acres or smaller from that perspective.
Yes.
Just kind of let it be.
Yes.
For the average person to
That's
kind
right.
of work through there. Fair enough. So I think, to kind of summarize everything, it sounds like There's really three layers or three levels of land that people need to kind of look at. The fully developed land, sort of the partially developed land, and then the fully raw land. And is it safe to say that, the quote unquote easiest one is the developed land, where you would basically just come in and quote unquote plug and play from those taps. And the raw land is obviously the hardest and the most risky from that perspective. And it sounds like there's everything in between, but if you could break it down into those three aspects, it sounds like that's pretty much the way to go. That just because, something to think about is that just because the developed land is more expensive than the raw land, there are all these hidden costs associated with raw land that you may not see and may not understand, but a consumer needs to be aware of that. Just because it's cheaper does not mean it will end up cheaper once they get into the build.
That's right. Just because, so if the piece of property is more expensive, there's probably a reason why, because there's more costs that have gone into that piece of property.
Yep, fair enough. Well, Shana, that's all the questions I have for today, but thank you so much for being here. I think it's been extremely informative for myself. Hopefully people who are viewing this get the same level of education out of it, and thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks for watching.